Hey, good evening, everyone. Let's go ahead and get started. I am Carrie Frederick Frost, the chair of the St. Phoebe Center for the Deaconess, and I welcome you to tonight's event, St. Phoebe Center's Proposed Guidelines, a presentation and discussion of the latest collaborative draft. Let us begin our evening in prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, Amen. Most holy Phoebe, who was found to be worthy of the diaconate, who was Paul's helper and carried his words to the people of Rome, who is called the lamp of Centuria, we now humbly ask that you intercede for us and pray to Christ our God for us as we discern his will for the revival of the ordained female diaconate for the upbuilding of the entire church today. Pray that we will be blessed and fruitful in our works this day and always, to God's glory. Amen. Again, good evening and welcome to our event this evening. For those of you who aren't familiar with our organization, the St. Phoebe Center is a U.S. nonprofit, and our mission is to educate and prayerfully advocate for the revival of the ordained female diaconate to help serve the ministerial needs of the Orthodox Church and the world today. We host Zoom events like this one. We have in-person events, and we provide material about the history, calls, and need for deaconesses in the Orthodox Church today. And I invite you to look at some of that material on our website, which is orthodoxdeaconess.org. This evening, we will discuss an important document published by the St. Phoebe Center, Proposed Guidelines for the Revival of the Ordained Female Diaconate in the Orthodox Church Today. After we hear from our panelists this evening, we will have time then for questions and discussions. And just so you know, the chat is turned off for now, but we will turn that on during the discussion time period. Our friend and advisory board member, Father Radu, will moderate this event. Father Radu is an Orthodox priest, an Orthodox scholar of ecclesiology and ecumenical relations, a professor at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, and author of the recent Icon of the Kingdom of God and Orthodox Ecclesiology. Father, thank you, welcome, and you have the floor. It looks like maybe Father Radu needs to be given the power to unmute. Bear with us for just a moment.
Thank you.
There we go.
I did not have the authority to unmute myself, which was probably a wise thing. But welcome, everybody, to this event. I am Father Radu Bordeianu, like Dr. Carrie Frederick Frost just said, and I will be moderating this discussion. Today, we are going to hear from three members of the board of our St. Phoebe Center for Deaconess, and they are going to discuss the new version of the center's proposed guidelines for the revival of the ordained female diaconate in the Orthodox Church today. We will soon have the link to that document. It's already public on the website. Hopefully you had a chance to review it. And we will first hear from the chair of our group, Dr. Carrie Frederick Frost, who will discuss the process of revision. And then she will address the changes that were made in sections 1, 2, and 3. After that, board member Dr. Teva Regule, she will discuss the revisions from sections 4 through 6. And board member and secretary Dr. Helen Creticos Theodoropoulos will discuss the revisions to sections 7 through 9. To talk about their accomplishments of these board members, to take me too long, I would highly recommend that you go to our website, Orthodox Deaconesses, and see about their academic activity, about their scholarly work. And without any further ado, I would like to also mention that we will, like I said, in the chat, you see available already, you will see available very soon the guidelines. And then there is an announcement that we are not turning on the chat yet, but rather later on, you are going to be able to pose questions there. I would ask you that you could please be respectful to one another in the chat, but I will give more instructions at that time. So let us hear from the chair of our group, Dr. Carrie Frederick Frost.
Thank you, Father Radu. Again, good evening to everyone. To start us off this evening, I will describe the process of the collaborative creation and revision of our proposed guidelines. And I would ask one of our people moderating the chat to put the link to the guidelines here in the chat for us. I will review, as Father Radu said, the first 3 sections and describe some of the revisions in the latest draft. And I invite you to look at those guidelines on screen, your screen, if you would like, or just simply to listen to me as we go along. So the proposed guidelines were composed over the last 4 years with input from all populations of the Orthodox Church, hierarchs, priests, deacons, laywomen, laymen, elders and youth, scholars and non-scholars. Many of you on the call tonight, as I saw your names as you came in, helped in one way or another. The proposed guidelines were created to address the existing need for a clear vision of what the order of deaconesses might look like today, along with a possible process for how the Orthodox Church might go about its revival. Now, the history of the order of deaconesses is well established. Many calls have been issued from different quarters of the Orthodox Church for more than a century, including the Pan-Orthodox Rhodes Consultation of 1988. The need for deaconesses has been articulated, and the aim of all efforts of the deaconess would be to minister particularly to women, but also to contribute positively to the salvation and spiritual care of the church's members and to the larger society. And the process of renewing this ancient order is already underway in Africa. And earlier this year in May, Deaconess Angelique Moulin was ordained in Zimbabwe. Yet, despite this history, the calls, and the need for deaconesses today, there's been little action outside of Africa taken to renew the order of deaconess. One possible reason is the lack of a plan, the lack of a roadmap. Although many in the Orthodox Church advocate for the renewal of this order, it lacks an action plan with attention to pragmatic questions: who, where, when, and how. The need for consideration of a pragmatic, concrete process was one reason the St. Phoebe Center created these proposed guidelines. In 2020, the St. Phoebe Center held an event in Chicago that addressed the need for deaconesses. At that time, an attendee said this to me. She said, "You've convinced me. I support deaconesses, but I can't imagine what it would look like to have them in the church today." This remark really stuck with me, as well as other board members of the St. Phoebe Center. This idea that someone who can see the need for having deaconesses in the church today, but couldn't quite imagine what it would look like. And so this need for an expansion of the imagination was another reason that the St. Phoebe Center crafted the proposed guidelines. Let me tell you about the process that we went through. At the very beginning, 2 members of the advisory board composed the original draft. Careful attention was paid to the Rhodes Consultations documents, which I mentioned a moment ago, one of the kind of seminal calls for deaconesses in the modern world, as well as other church documents regarding deaconesses. A first draft was prayerfully reviewed and modified by the St. Phoebe Center board, and that draft was then shared with a diverse group of trusted allies and friends of the St. Phoebe Center from many expressions of the Orthodox Church: men and women, deacons, priests, bishops, scholars, including historians, theologians, and liturgists, and non-scholars, and the entire St. Phoebe Center Advisory. Feedback from these different constituencies was then reviewed and integrated into the document, producing the first published draft of the proposed guidelines, which we issued in November 2023. This draft, the 2023 draft, was released during the St. Phoebe Center's 10th anniversary symposium, Deaconesses for the Orthodox Church Today, which was held at Hellenic College Holy Cross in November 2023 with the blessing of Archbishop Elpidophoros of America and with a letter of support from the Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew. This publication initiated a multi-month process of public feedback on the document, including a panel discussion at the symposium with Deacon Dr. Perry Hamalis, His Eminence Metropolitan Nathaniel, Dr. Jim Skedros, and Dr. Elizabeth Prodromou. Symposium attendees also had the opportunity to offer feedback orally and in writing, and discussion followed in which many conference attendees gave their feedback, and it was carefully noted by the St. Phoebe Board. The St. Phoebe Center published these proposed guidelines on its website at the same time as this symposium, so early November 2023, soliciting comments from any and all. The center then held an online event in January 2024 at the beginning of this year and received input from 3 panelists, Ms. Catherine McCord, Deacon James Wilcox, and Ms. Dina Zingaro, as well as from event attendees. The center repeatedly issued calls for feedback on its website and through its newsletter and social media. This feedback was impressive in quantity and quality. When I compiled all of it together, we had over 40 pages of thoughtful written feedback. So then St. Phoebe Center board members undertook the task of reviewing all of this feedback and listening again to the discussions from the November symposium, the January online panel, and the written feedback offered by dozens of Orthodox Christians. And we discerned what comments were appropriate to incorporate into a new draft. After the copious feedback was reviewed and integrated, the St. Phoebe Center Board solicited input once again from its advisory board and then approved the current version being the one that's linked here in the chat. The current version was published on our website and shared with American hierarchs, and we are still soliciting feedback on the current version. And let me emphasize that I just outlined this whole process of how we created the document, not to belabor the point or bore you, although I promise things will get more exciting in just a few minutes as we get into the details of the document, but to say that this has been a long, thoughtful, prayerful, and collaborative process. Creating a new draft of the proposed guidelines was no small task, and it had challenges in addition to the sheer volume of feedback. One of the goals in the creation of the document was to keep it simple. Instead of an academic doorstop, the board wished to create something that anyone from the church could read quickly and understand easily. We hoped to be specific enough to be meaningful and expand the imagination about deaconesses in the church today, but also general enough to hold the big picture in mind. So many valuable comments were not included strictly out of the desire to keep the proposed guidelines short and sweet. Let me now make some comments specific to each of the first 3 sections of the document. So the document starts off with part 1, the purpose and introduction. As it sounds, in this part, we discuss the reasons for creating this document, and we introduce the document. You've just heard some of the reasons that we created the document. In paragraph 2, which is about the orders of the clergy, we added something. We added a reference to the 3-fold ordained orders and the specific role of the diaconate. This was in response to suggestions that we more explicitly articulate the service ethos, the unique service ethos of the ordained order of the diaconate, its historical role, and the need for this ethos today in the form of deacons and deaconesses. Now, the St. Phoebe Center, as you may have noticed from our name, is focused on deaconesses, but we come from the conviction that the entire order of the diaconate and a restoration of this order is needed for the health and the good of the church today. Paragraph 3 is about the calls for deaconesses across the church. We added reference to the Rhodes consultation, which I mentioned before. And this was from several points of feedback that encouraged us to emphasize the fact that the St. Phoebe Center's work is not a one-off. It is a result instead, and it's inspired by those who have gone before us and the many calls throughout the Orthodox world to ordain women as deaconesses. In paragraph 4 of this first section, again, we're on the section Purpose and Introduction. The fourth paragraph is about the purpose of these guidelines and creating a path forward. We added this particular sentence, I'm reading it, quote, "The history of the deaconess rightly informs the church, but it does not determine the church. The diaconate of today should serve the needs of today." This particular sentence came from feedback from several people who urged us to make it clear that while the move to have deaconesses in the Orthodox Church today is based on historical precedent, it is not involving time travel. It is not involving importing something from the past whole cloth into today. Instead, it is about relying on the pillar of the historical precedent, but creating something that is meaningful here in the 21st century. The fifth paragraph of this section talks about women's roles in the Orthodox Church, and it situates deaconesses within the larger situation of women's roles in the church, emphasizing this is one of many ways women can and should be involved in church ministry. All of us at the St. Phoebe Center understand and appreciate that women always have been, are, and always will be essential to the life of the church in many different ways. All of these ways are valuable and meaningful, and having deaconesses in the church would complement and support all these other ways that women minister in the church. We also added to this section a note of theological anthropology, a note about who we are as humans and what it means to be men and women. Here's what we say, quote, "This expansion of women's roles," we're talking about the expansion of women's roles in recent history in the Orthodox Church. "This expansion of women's roles is apt because the Orthodox Church understands women and men as equally created in the image and called to the likeness of God. At the same time, the Orthodox Church does not understand women and men as identical. The St. Phoebe Center therefore envisions deacons and deaconesses as sharing the same roles and functions, knowing that they will express those roles and functions differently based on their sex to the benefit of the entire church." Now, I will just make a note here. We crafted this language before the ordination that took place earlier this year in Zimbabwe, but this is what we have seen happen in Zimbabwe. Deaconess Angelic was ordained with the same rite used for a male deacon, with this idea that she will have the same roles as her deacon counterparts, but she will live those out differently because she is a woman and because she brings her experiences as and perceptions as a woman to the role of deaconess. Now I'm going to move on to the second section of our document, which is eligibility, formation, and training. So as you can tell, this is about the basic requirements of being a deaconess. The first paragraph deals with some of these basic requirements and particularly theological education. So this is our ideal that women who might become deaconesses are theologically trained, but based on feedback, we added a kind of qualification for exceptional cases. Here is the sentence, quote, "There may be exceptional and rare candidates whose pastoral skills, life experience, and personal spiritual development are deemed sufficient without prior theological training." End quote. So that sentence was in reaction to several examples that we received, several personal examples of people saying, there's this woman in my parish, she's serving in this particular way with this diaconal service kind of ethos. She's ready to be a deaconess tomorrow. She has all the things that it takes. And we wanted to, what we were urged to do and to include in the document was to create a space for maybe someone who already has those talents and skills and is already doing the work. And I will note here too that this is actually the case with Deaconess Angelic in Zimbabwe, that she is not formally theologically trained. She did receive theological training from her bishop. She went through a process with him, but she does not have a formal diaconate certificate or something like that. So again, the ideal is theological education. I think this is the ideal for deacons in the Orthodox Church today too, and so it should be for deaconesses, but there may be some possibilities there. In the second paragraph of this section, we talk about eligibility. And one of the things we added to this draft was that both monastic and married women should be eligible to be deaconesses. Now, we have many examples in the ancient world of unmarried, monastic, and widowed deaconesses. And to some degree, the canons seem to support this. But we also have examples from the ancient world of married deaconesses. And we also have an example from our contemporary time. Deaconess Angelic herself is married. And this speaks to the need for today, the need for having a role of deaconess that is meaningful for today. In the ancient world, it made sense to have a particular type of woman to have this public role of deaconess. But today we have different social mores, and that's different. And so we at the St. Phoebe Center, again, from feedback, feel that it made sense to incorporate the possibility of married women serving as deaconesses today. Now, the third paragraph of this section is about canons and requirements. The new version that you have before you of the proposed guidelines more thoroughly and directly addresses the canons relating to deaconesses, explaining that, quote, canons are not intended as rigid dictates, but as guidelines to promote deification within the church according to local circumstance. And that was added because several people urged us to, very simply but directly state our take on the canon law and how it relates to the restoration of deaconesses today, or how it might relate. In the same paragraph, we state that deaconesses are not eligible as presbyters and bishops. Now, this is keeping, I want to underscore here, with the St. Phoebe Center's laser-tight focus on deaconesses. And this is a disappointment to some, because we did receive some feedback from people who wanted us to advocate for women as priests and bishops. And I want to point out that there was a kind of interesting tension among the comments that we received, some of the comments that we received. Some supporters wanted the St. Phoebe Center to go further and to advocate for more expanded roles for women in the church. But the St. Phoebe Center has always been perfectly clear that our mission is tightly focused on the renewal of the female diaconate based on this historical precedent, based on the calls for it, and based on the need today. Now, on the other hand, we had other supporters who felt that the center had gone too far in advocating for deaconesses that minister broadly to the church, not confining their ministry strictly to women, and not expanding on any roles deaconesses might have had in the ancient world. The center understands, as I said a moment ago, that history of the deaconess rightly informs the church, but it doesn't determine the church. And we feel that the diaconate of today should serve the needs of today. So we therefore envision deacons and deaconesses as sharing the same roles and functions, again, as I said a moment ago, expressing them differently based on being men and women, and that in fact would be to the benefit of the entire church. To me, the fact that we have people that support our mission to have deaconesses in the church today, but come from these different places and have different priorities and preferences, I think that's really telling. To me, what it says is that the supporters of the renewal of this order come from different backgrounds and they have diverse perspectives themselves. All sorts of people support the renewal of the order of deacons. I will move on to section 3, which may be the shortest section in the document, so I don't have a lot of news for you today, but it's on screening and recommendation for having candidates to be deaconesses. And we changed this section very little. We did add the requirement of background checks. This is simply the standard of behavior today in the church for ordaining clergy, but also in many cases having people volunteer at the church or be involved with children and so forth. And so of course this makes sense to have this included in our document. So I'm going to wrap up my comments here and then pass the baton on to the other panelists. But let me say a few things in conclusion. One, the current draft is a unique document. It was composed with the comments and feedback by so many people in the church and so many different people in the church coming from different places and different stations in life. And again, many of you, I see your names on the screen, many of you contributed one way or the other. Thank you for that. This document is truly a communal vision for the future of the church. And let me emphasize too that this newest draft is by no means the final one. As we state in the document itself, this is not comprehensive. It's not meant to be the final word. The St. Phoebe Center has written and released this document to prompt the church to begin a deliberate process towards ordaining deaconesses. While this document belongs to the center, the process does not. The Orthodox Church itself, faithful and clergy working together, will create a process that may in part or may not reflect the current draft of the St. Phoebe Center's proposed guidelines. The discussion tonight and the continued conversations across the church about this issue are meaningful to us. We will continue to receive feedback and we will continue to thoughtfully and seriously consider what we receive. We invite all of you to send us your thoughts and comments about this latest draft. We have invited all of our hierarchs to do the same. May the proposed guidelines spark our God-given creativity as a community and facilitate conversation and action regarding this urgently needed ministry. That is my prayer, and that is the prayer of the St. Phoebe Center Board. Thank you for your time and attention. And now I will pass over to Teva, I believe.
Well, good evening, everyone. It will be my task to speak to sections 4 through 6 of this document, and I would like to begin by sharing my screen. I hope everyone can see the both the before and the after version of our current document here as it exists. So what are these needs that we talk about when we speak to reviving and revitalizing the female diaconate? And how can we expand our vision to see a robust diaconate, and in particular, a female diaconate to actually meet those needs? So this is how we actually start the possible ministries of the diaconate. And in our previous version, we spoke of the need for church-sanctioned women to women ministry, to ministry of women to the entire church, and outreach beyond its members. We then fleshed that out a bit to speak in terms of what kind of things might be involved: pastoral counseling, chaplaincy, companioning, teaching religious subjects, missionary outreach, interfaith witness, philanthropy, nursing and social work, parish administration, family ministry, youth and young adult ministry. All those very valuable and I believe needed in the church today. In our new document, we actually specified, and more particularly in terms of that this ministry should be an ordained ministry. And what we mean by ordination, I think is important to speak to, and what we do speak to at the bottom of the paragraph, where we talk about being vetted and trained and given the authority and the support of the church. In the Orthodox understanding, an ordination is something that sets up a reciprocal relationship between the church and the ordained. They are given the authority and support of the church, but then they have the responsibility to her. They need to be trained, they need to be vetted, and then they're given the sacramental blessing of the Holy Spirit to connect what we do in the liturgy of our lives to the sacramental life of the church. Now, unlike in Roman Catholic theology, we do not believe in an objective ontological change in the ordained, nor is it merely just a functional category, as in most Protestant traditions. So it's important to understand what we mean when we say we have this ordained ministry. So then we go ahead and flesh out perhaps a little more clearly what we mean by some of the needs for, in fact, women to women ministry. So in particular, when we speak of women to women ministry, we're speaking of things like sexual and spousal abuse, fertility and childbearing, child rearing, and things like in dealing with women's health and women's aging. All of these things very particular to the lives of women. We then flesh out more particularly what might be considered professional activities of women in terms of using their education, such as chaplaincy or nursing, social work, or religious catechesis. And in addition, some that might not require professional training, such as missionary outreach, interfaith witness, philanthropy, parish administration, family ministry, or youth and adult ministry. All of these are then tied to the sacramental life of the church. For instance, if we have a chaplain, the chaplain, when they're visiting the ill and infirm, should be able to take the Eucharist to them, to after they in fact have spoken with them, to give them the life and the enlivening power of Christ through the Eucharist, the elements of bread and wine. So we want to reiterate that all of this, we believe, contributes positively to the deification and the spiritual edification of both the church and the membership at large. Next, I want to move on to the possible liturgical duties that we've outlined for this particular ministry. And this is probably the most controversial part of our document. We know that in antiquity, the public liturgical role of the deaconess was more circumscribed than the deacon. We know that she was ordained inside the sanctuary, and in the absence of a male deacon, prepared the sacred vessels, most likely in the sanctuary once that preparation moved from the outdoor area, the Scevophylakion, into the sanctuary itself. We also know that the deaconess anointed women at baptism and shepherded them in their Christian journey, as well as then took communion, the Eucharist, to their homes and to women's monasteries as well. And we can assume, we might assume that the deaconess in women's monasteries also censed, as the ecclesiarch and or the abbess does today, and probably most likely also assisted in the sanctuary as monastics do today as well. Now in Byzantium was a highly segregated society in terms of sex, in terms of economic and social class, and most likely in terms of race and other characteristics that divide us today. So the question then is, what might this ministry look like for today when we are in a society with fewer restrictions on the public lives of women? And even today, the laity can read the epistle and on occasion preach as well. So do our orders evolve? And if they do, how? And we know from history that they do evolve, our orders do evolve, usually organically through meeting the needs of a particular circumstance, or sometimes at the directive of a particular bishop. But at their best, they evolve to meet the needs, the pastoral needs of the people. Now we know in the early 20th century, there was a woman ordained in the Russian Orthodox Church, Deaconess Paraskiva Matashina, and in particular, she was subsequently recognized as a saint of the church. And her vita, they speak to the fact that she was ordained particularly for altar service. We know that Bishop, now Saint Nectarios, also ordained deaconesses for his monastery to, among other things, have a fuller liturgical life in that setting by, in fact, reciting petitions, reading the gospel, and serving communion to the faithful there. And as Carrie mentioned, the recently ordained Deaconess Angelic in Zimbabwe, and also ordained likewise, and to serve in liturgical capacity for her community, as well as the service needs of that community. And it should be noted that when the Armenian Church revived the female diaconate, they did so with the intention that both male and female will serve similarly. I also want to speak more fundamentally to what the role of the deacon is and how they differ from the bishop and the priest or the presbyter. Now we see the bishop as, in fact, the overseer of their community, the guardian of the teaching and tradition of the church, kind of the center of the visible unity of the church. And this is somewhat distinct from the presbyter, who's more particularly acts as the delegate of the bishop, and he is the sacerdotal ministry of the Eucharist. Through his hands, we offer our sacrifice of praise, and it's from those hands that we receive the peace of Christ. But the deacon is different. The deacon connects the liturgy of our lives to the sacramental life of the church. The diaconate is not a sacerdotal ministry, but one of service. Liturgically, we can think of the deacon as kind of the go-between between the people in the nave and what's happening in the sanctuary. And we know historically that the diaconate has been this ministry of service, and including pastoral care, philanthropic outreach, ecclesial administration, ministry of the word, and the service in liturgical assembly. So in our former version, we spoke of the possible liturgical duties of the female diaconate, and in particular, correlated it with the male diaconate by virtue of the ordination to major orders, or what we call hierotonia. Things like censing, reading the gospel, joining processions, preparing the gifts, sermons, giving communion, and then taking the sacrament to the ill and infirmed. All something that was conferred on her by her ordination. In our subsequent document, or rather in our new revised document, we first speak more particularly about how the diaconate connects our liturgy of our lives to the sacramental life of the church, including particular aspects of sensing the liturgical space, in other words, reclaiming it for the faithful. We offer petitions for the concerns of the people. We're connecting the lives of the people to the sacramental life of the church. We proclaim the gospel. We offer sermons for the edification of the people, join processions, help in preparing the offering of the people, and distributing then communion to the faithful and taking it to their homes when necessary. So here we wanted to make a tighter connection to understand more fully how the diaconate functions as this go-between, as a representative of the people. We acknowledge that the deaconess in the Byzantine world had a more circumscribed role than that of male deacons, but once again emphasize that we want to have a diaconate that actually reflects our own time, and that this ministry then is an extension and expression of the sacramental ministry of the diaconate conferred upon ordination, or rather by virtue of her ordination. Now we also realize that it may not look the same in different places. So we actually do allow for a variance in terms of time and place, or perhaps local custom, or anything that, for instance, the bishop might suggest in order to be accepted by the local community. In terms of, so it might look differently depending upon where you are and what the community can accept at that time. But we also want to emphasize, I think, what is important is the efficacy of this, in that it brings a well-needed kind of feminine insight and presence to the church. It is not, by doing the same things, we are not erasing gender, and yet at the same time, we are not overly essentializing it. So it's not that we are erasing gender just by quote unquote doing the same things that men are doing. We're doing what the deacon is doing, but we may do it somewhat differently, or the deaconess may do it differently based on her own unique gifts and talents, and those of her sex as well, from her own life experience. The last section is the accountability, or the last section that I will preview is the accountability and evaluation. Here we speak of the importance of following canonical and ecclesiastical protocols, and then that any evaluation should include the deaconess, perhaps her parish priest, spiritual father and or mother, and if a monastic, her abbess, and of course, local hierarch. In our revised versions, we also, in fact, follow that we believe that the deaconess should follow ecclesiastical protocols as such, and that the evaluation now should include not only the deaconess and her parish priest, spiritual father, monastic, and hierarch, but also the local parish. Her local community should be able to give input into how this into how she is living out this order for the betterment of that particular community. Once again, we want to emphasize that in both cases, the purpose of this is to strengthen the body of Christ. And hopefully by following these particular steps that we can in fact do so. And with that, I'll stop my share and hand it over to Helen.
Why is it? I should be unmuted now, correct? Okay. Thank you, Teva. I'm happy to say that my section was a little bit simpler than Teva. Teva had the heavy lifting here. The sections that I cover are 7, 8, and 9. 9 is simply the conclusion. 7, however, looks to the parish. We had very few changes in section 7, but I do want to uplift some of the elements of this section because I do think it's very important for us to recognize that the deaconesses are not just going out into the general church, but they're going to specific communities. And these communities also need to be prepared. And we have this understanding in our guidelines. So this section looks to the importance of the parish, its preparation, its education, its needs, and the feedback that it will provide with this reintroduction of the ministry of the female deacon. It's essential to consider this community. How have they progressed? How have they been prepared? We have to be sensitive to their background and the customs of these parishes. While we are educating the women and preparing them, we will be educating and preparing the parishes. And this is what this particular section addresses. Patience is needed, but so is courage. We see in this particular section, though, that it is not only the understanding of women's participation that has to be sort of reintroduced or understood by our parishes, but in fact, the understanding of diaconal ministry in and of itself. Teva has spoken to this, but we see that this has been forgotten, it has been diminished, it has not become really understood fully in the life of our parishes. And the more that we understand fully the essential nature of diaconal ministry, how vital it is, how it's so ancient to the life of the church, it's always been present in the life of the church, central to its worship, central to its activity in the world. We will then also better understand how female diaconal ministry is essential and important. So that section is number 7, beyond looking at the preparation of the parish. It addresses how absolutely key the support of the local hierarchy and clergy is. The parish looks to their priest and hierarch for direction on this. And we recognize how important their support, guidance, and affirmation of this is. And then, of course, the need for continued consultation and feedback. In section 8, we turn to how do we make this actually happen? The proposed process, sort of feet on the ground, make it practical. It's one possible path. It's a carefully considered path. And of course, we've thought long and hard about how this could actually roll out. But nevertheless, these are suggestions, and we understand that there are many various ways in which this can actually take form. One of the things that we did note in the changes from the previous guidelines to today was that we stopped describing this initial rollout, as a pilot program. We dropped that language because it suggested something that's a simple trial, and it really is not respectful to the recognition that this is the real thing we're talking about. People are dedicating their lives here. This is something that will happen in parishes with people who are committing their lives now to this process. So it's not a pilot program. This is actually the rolling out of the path for making the female diaconate a reality in the life of the church. Highlighted in this section is the importance of the local church and the Holy Synod of Bishops. Now, this language was there before, but I think it's a little bit stronger in this section now because there have been some questions raised as to whether the entire church has to make this decision. And it is clear from the affirmation of the Great and Holy Council in Crete in 2016 and in previous affirmations by the church that indeed the local Orthodox Synod is free to minister to the local needs of their church and does not need to consult the entirety of the church, especially and particularly because this is not a change in any kind of doctrinal teachings. So that was something that I think also needs to be identified, and clearly they're identified here as part of this process of rolling out this sort of feet on the ground happening of the female diaconate. We speak about the creation of the Deaconess Revival Commission. We did expand the understanding of how to compose that with one particular word, calling the addition of intergenerational. And that's important because we understand that it isn't just about men and women. It's not just about clergy and laity. And of course, we also talked about drawing from all the active ministries of the church because that's where you'll see the needs. But let's look at the whole span of the life of our faithful. And we wanted to include this idea of intergenerality. We added one particular phrase regarding those who will be selected. Of course, we have the Deaconess Revival Committee, Commission, and the Holy Synod of Bishops are identifying and evaluating the cohort of candidates who are beginning this rollout. But in addition, it came to our attention that qualified women would want to apply. And we didn't actually have that in our language of our document. Not just that other people will identify them, but that qualified women would offer themselves, knowing in their hearts that they have been called to this ministry. And of course, they would have to be considered through an application process. We modified a little bit the language about vestments, simply dropping the section on the non-liturgical public clothing, but focusing instead on vestments of the deaconess liturgical functioning, and that should be like those or equivalent to that the deacons and culturally sensitive, since we have a good historical foundation for that. We did talk about what the deaconess will be named, and this is something that was not present in the previous documents and is now here, the suggestion being calling her Deaconess X or Mother Deaconess, and then her name. And so this section covers the way in which the rollout might happen. And we come then to section 9, the conclusion. It's very simple, but we have now added a nod of thanks, not to only those who've been working for the restoration of the female diacon for over 100 years. And there, of course, are many people to be remembered and thanked, but of course, also the recent action by the Holy Synod of Alexandria has to be recognized and is recognized in our conclusion. We offer these thoughts, these guidelines for the purpose of infusing the presence and perspectives and talents of women throughout the whole church. The renewal of diaconia, as I said before, it is not simply a matter of uplifting women. We are talking about revitalizing the diaconia of the church. In humility, we offer this for the glory of God and for the benefit of God's people. So,
thank you very much to our three presenters. I'm sure I speak in the name of the 52 participants to this live event, as well as those who are going to watch the recording at a later time. When I say that we are all deeply grateful to all of you. We are slightly ahead of the schedule, so if you do not mind, I would like to, before we start our conversation, to say that initially we were worried about the time, and I said go to the website and see the biographies of the three speakers, but maybe I can just say a sentence or two about each and every one of them so that as we continue our discussions, you will know that Dr. Carrie Frederick Frost, she is the chair of our group. She received her doctorate in theology, ethics, and culture from the University of Virginia. She authored many articles, edited books, and she has a monograph entitled Maternal Body. She teaches at St. Sophia Ukrainian Orthodox Seminary and at Western Washington University. Our second speaker was Dr. Teva Regule, who over 15 years served as managing editor of the St. Nina Quarterly. She's involved in other scholarly associations in the Orthodox Church, particularly OTSA, Orthodox Theological Society of America. She has been the president, and she has published a lot on the ministry of women. She received her PhD in liturgical theology from Boston College. And last but not least, we heard from Dr. Helen Creticos Theodoropoulos, whose PhD comes from the University of Chicago Divinity School. She teaches at St. Sava Serbian Orthodox School of Theology, and she is a professor of patrology there and Christianity in America. She also has been lecturer at Loyola University of Chicago and University of St. Mary of the Lake. So we are now going to engage in a dialogue. And before we do that, we do have a statement about a respectful discussion. And I would like to read this to all of you. The St. Phoebe Center seeks to promote respectful and reasonable discussion about once again ordaining women to the diaconate in the Orthodox Church and about these proposed guidelines. We expect that all participants, both panelists and attendees, will treat each other with the highest regard, acknowledging that we are all children of God, and will engage with the topic at hand and refrain from personal criticism. We ask that if a specific example of an incident in the life of the church is offered, that any identifying remarks of people involved, or if a personal story of any others involved, be withheld, so that we may discuss these issues generally and with respect for privacy. Participants who engage in personal attacks or otherwise denigrate the conversation will not be welcome to our events. Finally, we encourage your curious, robust, and respectful engagement in the work of St. Phoebe Center. So, to get the discussion going, we have received several questions through the chat. I encourage you to continue to use that option, but also you can raise your Zoom hand, and then I will recognize you, and then we can have the discussions. Please try to keep your questions short, and it would be ideal if you could ask questions more than make comments, and then maybe this is too optimistic. Even better if you ask a question to which you do not know the answer. So let's start with C.S. Peter Lee. You have your hand up.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. A wonderful talk and wonderful document. It was very clear, very simple, and thank you for inputting so many of our inputs. I have a just practical question. How many deacons are on payroll? in the United States? And my second question is this guide assuming for the diaconate, female diaconate, on a payroll, or is being on a payroll is totally not part of this document as an assumption?
Thank you for that question. I don't know the answer to your first question of how many deacons in the U.S. are on payroll. Do any of my other panelists, or maybe Father Radu, just want to take a stab at that? Does anyone have a sense of that?
I only know in our particular parish, they both, we have two deacons in our parish. They both get stipends, but it's not an honor. It's more like an honorarium for their service. It's not a salary as the priest is salaried. So I think it depends on the size of the parish and their financial wherewithal. And this is something that I think the church will need to address moving forward, to not to perhaps expand the understanding of what might be compensated ministry in the church.
Thanks, Teva. Thank you. I mean, what comes to mind for me, for one thing, in the document, we do have a statement somewhere saying that this will be at the discretion of the parish, because different parishes have different traditions in terms of compensation. And, my impression is that that does vary in terms of deacons and would vary in terms of deaconesses. I will just add a little interesting footnote, though, which is that Deaconess Angelic in Zimbabwe receives a stipend. And that is the kind of across the board expectation in Zimbabwe, because deacons are doing the full work of the diaconate. It's not just a liturgical helper situation. They're doing ministerial work, they're doing service work, and inside and outside of their parish, it just makes perfect sense for them to have some sort of compensation.
I want to bring to note one of the comments from Father Peter Batkus in the chat. He says that many deacons, at least in the OCA, are not actually allowed, that those who full-time, in other words, only full-time ministers get a vote as clergy at the All-American Council, which means they're on the payroll. So deacons in this category are understood more as lay people for the purposes of voting at the All-American Council. But so there is variation in terms of how each jurisdiction understands the value of the diaconate and its place among the clergy, I think, at least in terms of church governance.
I wanted to bring up one possibility that we did not address in this document, but I want us to consider, since we're imagining these possibilities. And that is that a deaconess might actually be attached to multiple parishes. It's more likely that we will have the deaconess tightly connected to the bishop. Certainly in the ancient church, the deacon or deaconess was connected to the bishop and directed by him. And this is certainly in the beginning, when there would be few, it might actually be a more successful system to have her attached to the metropolis or to the bishop of the area, and therefore assist or provide services and ministries at a variety of parishes. Under circumstances like that, compensation maybe would not come from just one parish, but from multiple parishes. I think we have to allow ourselves to be creative and think of a variety of ways of utilizing this ministry and seeing it reinvigorated and active in the life of the church.
Helen, in fact, one of the questions that we received in the chat fits here very well. The person is talking about the various differences that you are proposing in the guidelines between different areas, and those would be left to the discernment of the bishop and the parish. There would be some differences between the way in which men exercise the diaconal ministry and women exercise the diaconal ministry. So the question is, can you elaborate a little bit on some of these differences? Who decides ultimately? How might some of these differences look like? What have you seen maybe from the feedback that you have received to these proposed guidelines, you and the other members of the board?
Helen, are you going to address that question? Unmute if you are. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I thought that was addressed to you, Carrie. Okay. So I'm sorry, could you just re-specify your question, Father Radu?
Speak a little bit more about the different ways in which the diaconate would look in different places in the world, as well as what would some of the differences be between the male diaconate, female diaconate as they exercise their roles, but also how would the bishop or who would be the one who decides? Is it the bishop?
Okay. So
Local.
here's I think where we really have to pay attention to that interlinking between need and qualifications, capacities, talents, perspectives, training. We have women who would be exceptional in terms of offering ministry with regard to situations of abuse, sexual, problems of diminishment and interaction. We have women who would be better trained in terms of education. We have different, or in offering guidance in terms of childcare or having experiences with miscarriage, et cetera. But what I'm seeing is that we would need to identify those areas in various places and parishes where you see this need, and then sort of connect the women with the parish. Of course, you have to have the episcopacy, the hierarchy, interested and open to hearing about the needs of the parishes and invested in finding ways to address these needs. These are ways that women can offer ministry that you don't find available right now through the ministries that are out there. Are there places where women can also serve the needs of men? Absolutely. Our care for the elderly, our care for the isolated and infirm, those who are often isolated and alone. Women are certainly not there just to minister to other women for specifically female needs. This is true of our male diaconate, though, of course, as well. We isolated them to this little tiny pocket of liturgical assistance where there's so much more in the life of the church from its history, but also from its current needs that the diaconal ministry can address. Will this be compensated? Yes and no. Many times the compensation actually comes from the secular realm, but it can be also supplemented and sort of amplified through the church. In addition, we have the various liturgical ministries that we could see women beginning to take part in and offering their support and presence, et cetera. So I'm going to let others speak to this, but I definitely see that what we need is this sort of linking between the needs of the parish and the communities and the abilities and talents of the women and understanding how to put it all together.
May I, excuse me, add some thoughts to that? Thanks, Helen. I really like this question because for me, it really pushes us to imagine what it might be like to have deaconesses. And that's very much in the spirit of this document, is to get us to really start to visualize this and how would this play out? What would it look like here? And I think when we look back to the history of deaconesses, there was no one uniform role throughout the ancient world that deaconesses did. From what we can tell, they did different things in different places, according to local need and according to what their bishop directed them to do. And I think that's actually really beautiful. And as the Orthodox Church, I think we are at our best when we have the freedom to respond locally to what's happening and minister to local needs. So I'm not quite answering the question because I'm saying it's going to look different locally, and that's actually a really wonderful thing.
Thank you. And now, Dr. Paul Meindorf.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Good. I had a question earlier for Dr. Frost regarding whether any of the bishops have responded to the text that you have sent them, positively or negatively. That's my question. My comment has to do with the role of deacons. In the 20th century, with the restoration of frequent communion, there's a desperate need for more than one person to distribute communion. And so, I mean, that's a very practical pastoral function that in the Orthodox Church can only be done by ordained. As we know, the Catholic Church has Eucharistic ministers to do that. We have not moved in that direction, which makes deacons all the more necessary, male and female. And since there are not enough male deacons, that's, you know, one very practical role that would be acceptable, I think, to most people who may resist to some other functions, you know, especially liturgical functions.
Thank you, Paul. Good to see you. Thank you. So in answer to your first question about bishops and responses from bishops, I have received many responses from bishops that are private, you know, in terms of private correspondence. They've told me what they thought or what they thought should be different. And a lot of that is reflected in the document. There hasn't been a lot of public response from bishops. And I would, in fact, urge everyone that's here to consider sharing this document with your bishop and asking your bishop what he thinks of it. I think that's a productive way to have a conversation around this issue. We did have Metropolitan Nathaniel of the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese, the metropolis of Chicago, with us at our symposium. And so he did respond in some ways to the first draft of this document, but that's really the only public response, I would say, that's on record. I hope there'll be more. And this is something, you know, we are always at the St. Phoebe Center trying to have those conversations with our hierarchs and would like to see more and more of that and would love everyone's help here doing that. The distribution of the Eucharist, your comment there, I will just say back that that's one of the things that I witnessed Deaconess Angelic do when I was in Zimbabwe, was distribute the Eucharist. And it held this very pragmatic function. It was a parish with a lot of people receiving the Eucharist. And so it helped in that pragmatic way. But also, I mean, for me, obviously, I have never seen that. You know, I'd never seen that before in my life, a woman distribute the Eucharist, and it was spiritually powerful and spiritually fulfilling. So this pragmatic function, but then also kind of the spiritual implications as well.
There were several questions in the chat about the interaction between the center and bishops, including if there is a plan on how to convince synods to implement those commissions, to set up those commissions for the diaconate. So maybe I can restate that question again. You mentioned, Carrie, that we should talk to our own bishops and present them the document. Is there another plan that the center has to interact with the synods who then would appoint such commissions?
I would say that and feel free other board members to chime in here, but it's my read of the situation that we're still working on the personal level. You know, we're still having conversations with bishops, making appointments, meeting with them, talking about the center's work, asking them how we can help them. We are not, from my read of the situation, ready to go before a synod, for example. I think it's better to kind of build those relationships and that trust with individual bishops before we appear in a room asking for something. So I'd say we're still at that personal level, and that's one of the reasons that I encourage people here to personally contact their hierarch if they are interested in this issue, whether it's about this document or just in general, to have conversations about having deaconesses again in the church.
I'm just waiting to see if there are any other reactions for board members, and enough productive silence. Varvara Gulina, you have the floor. I see your hand up.
Thank you so much. Well, my first question is, in light of the shortage of clergy that the church is going to experience in the future, just based on the data that we have now, I'm wondering if the St. Phoebe Center is going to be willing to somehow make it a point to speak of the need of the female diaconate in light of this problem, and if perhaps this is something that may get the attention of the bishops in our hierarchy more, because I do think that it's a significant problem. And again, it seems like with sort of this surge of women becoming interested in this ministry, this could really address it. And then my second question is, how do you recommend that we prepare the parishes in order to accept a deaconess? I wonder if this is a matter of just reaching out, let's say, to a priest, and if he is open to it, like talking to him about it, and then hopefully he would prepare the parish by speaking to them about it. Can it be done in this way, or does it have to be more systematic, more kind of coming from the top down? And does St. Phoebe Center perhaps have a plan, and like who would be doing the education of the community? Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Since Helen and Teva didn't unmute, I'll go ahead and take a stab at your questions. So the clergy shortage, yes, this is something that the St. Phoebe Center has made this particular point to our hierarchs, is that this is one of many possible ways to address a clergy shortage, to have deaconesses again in the church. And I will happily share that I regularly write to all of the US bishops and give them updates about our work. That's usually a kind of one-way correspondence because it's updates. It's not meant to be asking for anything. And in my most recent missive sent to hierarchs, that's one of the things that I talked about, was the way that having deaconesses today can address that particular concern. And of course, we could do more with that as a center. And I think that is something that is meaningful to hierarchs and many of the faithful. So that might be a good thing for us to think about how else to work with that. Thank you. And then in terms of preparing the parishes, I think what's interesting about this is this also varies really widely locally. I know parishes who are prepared in the sense that there's a general understanding of the history of this order of deaconess, that there's an understanding for the need, that there are women in a parish who are doing this sort of work and would be, capable and ready to step into this role of deaconess. So there's some parishes that are kind of already there. But in terms of other parishes, I think that what I think is needed, and we're not super specific about this in the document, but I think we just need to have these conversations, and we need to normalize these conversations about deaconesses in the church. And that means everything from, asking your priest, as you said, about that, but also just having conversations at coffee hour, not just having events with the St. Phoebe Center, which is great too. We should do that as well. But really being able to talk about it. I think normalizing the conversation, having people be aware of the history and the need, I think that's one of the ways that all of us can effectively work to prepare.
I'd like to add quickly, sorry, Teva, I'll just add in a couple of things. I do think that having, there are indeed parishes who are definitely more ready. And part of that is because women are already much more visible and active in administration, in education, in finance, in chanting, and actually in doing some kind of liturgical service already within the life of this parish. And as you begin to see those things, you are definitely more ready to see a female deacon as well. A parish that has that and a male deacon already serving, again, you begin to understand the value of the diaconate. a parish like that also has some kind of, lecture series or educational program that talks about the history of the female diaconate. I happen to live in a parish that has all of those aspects. In addition, one more thing, a hierarch who has identified a parish and supports that parish in doing something that's a little bit sort of, it seems like it's new or different or whatever, but it's opening up the work of women and encouraging it and supporting it. When you have those things in place, you have a parish that is ready to embrace the female diaconate in a way that other parishes are just not even there yet. So those are some of my thoughts, Teva.
Most of what Helen said, actually, I was going to suggest. But one other thing that I think would be important is that it's a kind of a catch-22. We need more women who really feel called to the diaconate by their community to be trained and educated and come to say to the bishops, here I am, use me, that kind of thing. So as right now, many of them recognize a clergy shortage, but it is not for many, it's not quite on their radar screen that perhaps half the faithful, or some of half the faithful could actually help mitigate that problem. But if women were, in fact, there are many women who have friends and divs or others, that if they actually express the concern personally, then they might start thinking, well, why not? I could really use her here, that sort of thing, that kind of thing. So it might be the case that it comes not only from the top down, but also from the bottom up. And in terms of women who feel called to that ministry to take steps to become trained and then to present themselves to the bishop, say, please use me in whatever capacity that I can be of service to the church. And this might also be ways to kind of expand the conversation to allow them to imagine and to actually think of women in the diaconate, or in some kind of, perhaps as a first step, some kind of just diaconal ministry. And then it's easier for both the bishop to move and also for the parish then to accept if women are essentially already doing many of these diaconal functions, as Helen mentioned. So I think it is kind of a both and, kind of to attack the problem from many different angles in terms of that. So that was my short contribution to that conversation.
There is a question about the nature of this document. Will we ever have a finalized document? It mentions that is the latest draft. Can we consider it to be the final document? Or is it a living document?
I think it's important that it's a living document. I think it's important that we understand this to be the product of so many minds and hearts in the Orthodox Church. And as a community, we will continue to think about this and continue to head into a direction of having deaconesses in the church and hone what that might look like. So to me, it's important that that's a living document. Now, at the same time, I would love for Synod of Bishops to take this document and say, guess what? It's a final document. We're gonna go ahead and do it as it is outlined here. But a living document, both from the point of continuing to hear from the wisdom of the church, but also acknowledging that, as I said in my own remarks, we created this document at the St. Phoebe Center, but it's the church that has to have, the larger church that has to have this conversation and come to a final kind of process for having deaconesses again.
Yeah. So if I hear it correctly, it's a document that may change in the future, but it is ready to be shown to our respective bishops and to our respective synods. Yes, thank you. There was a question about the comparison between male deacons and female deacons in terms of the proposed criteria for selection. What would be the form of education? And I'm trying here to combine several questions that we received in the chat. What would be some ways to evaluate them? And are we proposing something that male deacons are not being evaluated on at this point? For example, there are several certificates that people can receive. However, do we know if any deacons who are ordained without a formal theological education, without male deacons ordained without formal theological education, without such certificates. In other words, if I may summarize all these questions, the criteria that we put before the ordination and after the ordination seemed to some to be maybe a little bit more than male deacons are going through. Is that the case or not?
Okay, I'll tackle that. Yeah, the bar is higher in a way. I think we'll just be honest about it. As we bring this to the attention of people, hopefully the bar will be set higher for the male diaconate, because the things that we are asking of the women are things that are actually pretty standard in asking of in other kinds of fields. Some kind of accountability, some kind of review, proper training. And so these are not huge asks. On the other hand, shortcuts taken in the past for ordaining deacons, sure, I'm sure that's happened. We don't want to set the bar that low. I don't think that's necessary. I think we can actually, I think we have women who are ready to step up and do everything that we've asked, and the church should follow those paths.
As we were talking about the prerequisites in terms of education, I would like to acknowledge some other comments in the chat that are giving examples of ways in which parishes support the education of those who are involved in various ministries. And so it is the duty of the local community also to educate its own ministers. Good. Let's go to Maureen Malcrone.
Thank you. I wanted to respond to something that came up a few minutes ago about we aren't seeing women present themselves for the diaconate. An analogy, and I'm from the Roman Catholic tradition and in the Diocese of Detroit, and several parishes there have started what we call ministers of service to, this was started actually before the diaconate was reinstituted. But most of the women who were interested in ministry, being a minister of service, were not willing to do altar service. And of course, almost every man who applied wanted to do that. So I agreed to go through the process myself. And during that time, I talked individually with many of the women who were taking the required training to encourage them to do that. And we did have, as a result of that, a number of women who stepped up to doing altar service. So I think maybe personal conversations with encouraging women who you see have talents, exploring the possibilities with them, encouraging them to think further and helping them to identify paths toward that may help.
Thank you. Any reactions? Yeah, I would like to thank you and say that it is our duty to learn from the experiences of our sister churches. And we all struggle with the same issues. And it is a great opportunity for all of us to face these issues together. Good. And now Barbara Harris, and after that, Elizabeth Prodromo.
Thank you. For those of you that know me, you'll know that I'm a really firm advocate for the restoration of the female diaconate. And so what I'm going to say kind of dovetails on some other things that Helen has said and that Elizabeth has said in the comments. I've actually had this conversation with my own local clergy and have actually been astonished at the reaction at how positive our clergy were, and how there was a huge affirmation that, yeah, I would take a male or a female deacon. Either one would be fine with me, but we need the help in our parish, and we could certainly enhance our ministries through these through these kinds of services. But what I really, the point I really wanted to make is we're all very well aware that there are, that there's a point of view that is not aligned with the point of view just expressed today, and that how to mitigate some of that. And I would just throw something out there, and it's just an idea, something I'm willing to work on. I do believe that we need to take, because we've been taking the long view on this anyway, many, many decades, take an even longer view in developing educational materials, such as lesson plans about those who have served as deacons, male and female, and what they've brought, what their unique ministries and gifts have been, and how they have really enhanced the lives of those in the church and built up the body of the faithful. I think Helen mentioned retreats, but also retreats for our peers, not just what St. Phoebe Center is doing, but for even lay people who have no idea of what a female deacon is or can do, and how that can really enhance or make a more vibrant parish life. So I think that education is really key going forward. Great work has been done to date, and I commend you all for everything that you've done so far. But in going forward, I'm certainly willing to help out with some of the educational stuff.
Thank you very much. Remember, this meeting is recorded. We heard you.
That's fine. I'm good for my word.
Good.
May I say something here? Would just thank you, Barbara. Thank you both for your ideas. And I love it when people have ideas, and I extra love it when people have ideas and want to help implement them. So thank you for that. And quite seriously, this is something we have constantly been working on as an organization, is this piece of education. What kind of materials are needed and what settings are they needed? And I think curricular materials, like you're talking about, whether those are for adult formation or for church school or for seminary programs, that's something that we have talked about many times, and we will circle back to, hopefully with your help. So thank you very much.
And now the last question.
Actually, I'd like to address,
Father
Radu, before we go to Elizabeth, I'd actually like to address part of Barbara's question, in terms that there are issues and people who don't subscribe to a positive view of the restoration and the revival of the female diaconate. And we have actually collated a number of these objections in our most updated quote unquote myths document. So if we could post that in the chat, that would be very helpful. I mean, I think it is important to realize that we often we are speaking of the diaconate particularly. We're not talking about the priesthood. There should not be a conflation between the two. There are two different ministries, and there are two different sets of questions when we speak of them. One has a history in the Orthodox Church and one does not. It is also true that there is a general, and we be sensitive to the general fear and apprehension of those coming into the church for whom this was an issue for them perhaps 50 years ago, and they've seen their traditions go down a different road, or a road that they would perhaps not subscribe to. But I would like to remind our listeners that when we speak of that, we really think we're really speaking almost in apples and oranges, because we have a totally different ecclesiology, a totally different polity, a totally different understanding of orders than is, I think, the majority of our Protestant friends. And I think those things need to be, in fact, understood more particularly. We have guardrails in place to help us not go off the rails in terms of that. So to be both sensitive to concerns, but also to sensitize those who have concerns that we're dealing in a different kind of milieu, and that is something that we take seriously and want to continue to live out within our own context, not just to repeat and or emulate what others are doing. Okay, so that's perhaps not expressed as clearly as I would like. I'd need much more time in order to do so. But I just want to acknowledge that not everyone is on board with this idea, and some have valid concerns and others have concerns that hopefully we've addressed, and to become more comfortable with those answers to those questions.
Indeed, we have no more time, and this is so sad, but I promised Elizabeth that she would speak. So we were supposed to end at 8:30. Could I please have everybody to continue 2 more minutes?
Thank you, Father, and thank you for letting me go last, because it gives me the opportunity to say thank you for the incredible discussion this evening, and to the board, and for all the extraordinary work that you've done. And thank you for all of us, allowing all of us to be part of this. Just two questions. One is, hearing the concerns about the fears of what might happen if we go forward with the, restoration of the female deaconess. And also that's oftentimes linked to why would we? And I think, at least from my perspective, it's important that we consider answering that. Why would we do this? Or why should we do this? By saying, why wouldn't we? And why shouldn't we? And if we're fearful of what might happen if we do it, we might answer that we should be more fearful of what continues to happen in the absence of having the female deaconess. So we should, because we have a responsibility to do what the church has called us to do. And if we're fearing what might happen without it, all we have to do is see what is happening. With it, all we have to do is see what's happening in its absence. So I think for me, those two are connected somehow. And I just wanted to share that as a thought. But the question is the following, at a very practical level, and this goes back to Barbara's question and some of the others. Is it possible to develop a strategic plan? I know I've asked about this probably ad nauseum by now, but a strategic plan about how we can do the kind of education and kind of religious literacy work at the grassroots level, and also engage with key institutional stakeholders that need to be part of this conversation. Is there a way for us to think about doing that systematically? And then at the top-down level, what are the environments where we have to engage with hierarchs in order to move beyond the current conversation? Because I think for hierarchs, it's for them to be engaged individually, that's great, but that's not how our church functions. I mean, at the end of the day, these will be synodal decisions. So I guess what I'm asking is there a kind of strategic mechanism or plan by which we can engage hierarchs in more collective fashion, simultaneous with the grassroots work? And I'm happy to contribute in any way to sort of trying to develop a plan that we can implement systematically. So thank you for your indulgence.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Good to see you. Thanks for being here. Well, I would say this is the nut we're always trying to crack as a center, is how to both work with our hierarchs and also work with a grassroots, as you say in the chat, from the top and from the bottom. This has been our work. It will continue to be our work. I don't know if we'll ever be as systematic as maybe you would like for us to be, because things have been a little bit more organic in developing those relationships, like I said earlier, with the hierarchs, and that's ongoing, that's happening. And then in terms of the grassroots, we are in the process of reconsidering how best to do that, how best to give our supporters kind of the tools and the information and the confidence they need to have these conversations. So that's a kind of stay tuned sort of thing, that our network is going to be something we're investing time in. But I think the other answer to both these questions, and this may not be a very appealing answer, is time, actually, is that, this takes time to develop these relationships with hierarchs and to have these relationships and give the information needed to our grassroots supporters. And we have been working on that. We are working on that, and we will be working on that in the future, because that's exactly, how we need to steer the ship going forward. So thank you for your offers to help too, which are warmly received.
As we can all see, especially if we read the chat, there is so much interest in this issue. There is so much support. And we would like to thank all of you on behalf of the St. Phoebe Center for your participation tonight. We would like to thank primarily our three speakers, members of the board, who presented the new updated guidelines. And if you could please all allow us to end in prayer. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God the Father and the communion of the Holy Spirit be with all of us through the prayers of Saint Phoebe, the deaconess. Amen. God bless all of you. Thank you for being present tonight. Bye-bye.